What's the deal with video game remakes? I hear they're remaking The House of the Dead because Sega lost the original source code.
You suck.
Wow, tough crowd. I wonder if Kramer's doing any better.
Shut up! 50 years ago you had you upside down with a fucking fork up your ass!
Whenever Hollywood announces a remake, it's almost always met with a collective eye roll and sigh, but in the video game industry, it's more than welcomed. There's nothing quite like seeing an old favorite, or a game you didn't get a chance to experience, get the remake treatment. A good remake can improve upon an already great game for fans and new audiences to experience. They don't necessarily need to compete against the original. In some cases, a remake can deviate from the formula to create an entirely new experience using familiar elements. There's a fine line developers walk while remaking these beloved games. Deviate too much from the original and you risk losing the fans. Remain too faithful and you're better off porting the original. In the case of The House of the Dead, remaking the arcade classic from the ground up was the only way to experience the game on modern hardware. As Seinfeld mentioned, Sega lost the original source code. Unless you happen to have access to an original arcade cabinet, or can afford to purchase one of the 2 official ports, you're out of luck. Unless of course you emulate it like I did. In contrast, the sequels have seen many ports over the years, and have remained relatively easy to access. This has done nothing but build the original's legacy as one of the greatest arcade games to ever exist.
Nobody leaves here alive.
Sophie!
Nearly 3 decades later, despite the lack of accessibility, the game has remained a cult classic to those who were lucky enough to experience it at the arcade. I can recall as a child my eyes being transfixed on the demo screen from across the pizzeria, utterly terrified of the game's gruesome visuals. Remaking this game from scratch was a tall order to fulfill. Sega, the IP holder, trusted the publisher Forever Entertainment, the company responsible for the Panzer Dragoon remake. Determined to modernize the game while maintaining the series' charm, development team Megapixel Studio took on the challenge. So, how did it pan out?
Nobody leaves here alive.
Sophie!
It's alright. The biggest challenge adapting this game to PC and home consoles was tweaking the arcade gameplay to better suit the at-home experience. Back when arcades were still around, these cabinets wanted nothing more than to suck as many quarters from players as possible. Sprinkled throughout the campaign are plenty of cheap hits and projectiles that require immediate attention. Not to mention the occasional crowd that would surround the cabinet, judging every small mistake you made. Many on-rail shooters, like The House of the Dead, weren't very long to complete either, hence the difficulty spikes. The remake offers 3 standard difficulty options, as well as the original arcade difficulty, which should feel familiar to seasoned veterans. Like myself. Oh fuck, what a cheap shot! Long gone are the days of the Wiimote and PlayStation Move, arguably the last generation to embrace on-rail shooters. Although I cannot speak for Nintendo's faulty Joy-Cons, on PC the mouse is a perfectly fine substitute for a light gun. A gun peripheral was worked on at some point during development, but was ultimately scrapped for an undisclosed reason. The most anticipated feature of any newly announced remake is the updated visuals, and this game looks good. Comparing the game to the most recent entry in the series, Scarlet Dawn, it's immediately apparent that the remake falls short in appearance. It would be easy to conclude that this is because one was made with the Unreal Engine and the other Unity, but the engine doesn't necessarily matter. Given the proper resources, time, and money, both engines can showcase impressive visuals, but the remake fails to impress. The original's graphics have aged poorly, but the jagged polygons on the enemies convey a unique sense of uncomfortability. I've always been a fan of the colors in particular. The crushed out blacks and violent reds heightens the mansion's haunting atmosphere. One new addition I am not a fan of is the ragdoll physics. The creatures lose all weight when killed, and you can't help but remember you're playing a game on the Unity engine. The physics all feel very stock. In comparison, Scarlet Dawn's death animations don't distract from gameplay. Even the originals feel quite natural. Playing around with the corpse of the dead is only fun for so long. The biggest omission this remake fails to recreate is the original soundtrack. According to the remake's co-producer, securing the rights proved to be quite a difficult process. So instead, they created a new soundtrack that drew heavy inspiration from the original. The new soundtrack is suitable, but it could never compete against Tetsuya Kawuchi's original score. You'd think it would all be spooky, but the soundtrack had some certified club bangers. The remake score is a faithfully done tribute, but could never live up to Tetsuya's compositions. The series' long-standing legacy is probably due in part to the incredible voice acting.
Who are you? Nobody gives me instructions. I shall destroy everything.
What happened?
Keep in mind, this game was originally released the same year as Resident Evil, but somehow came off even more cheesy.
Sophie, are you okay?
I was so scared!
The voice actors in the remake were instructed to closely match the B-movie aesthetic of the original.
Sophie, are you okay?
I was so scared!
I feel a little conflicted about the results. On one hand, these talented voice actors clearly understood their roles, but I believed the charm of the original was a result of a Japanese studio adapting the game to an English-speaking market. With no means of direct communication, I imagine lots of phrases found in the script were lost in translation. It might appear like I hate this game with how many critiques I've thrown at it, but it's actually quite the opposite. I did very much enjoy my time with this remake, but there are some changes that keep me from loving it. I and many others held this remake to a very high standard, maybe a little too unrealistic, some might argue. Sega holds some of the most influential and beloved IPs of the industry. I constantly found myself asking whether or not I'd like to see a Crazy Taxi remake done in the same vein. No doubt securing the soundtrack's many licensed songs would be difficult enough, but what about Pizza Hut and KFC? Why do movie remakes get hated on while video games get praised? I suppose the availability of streaming has made classic films more accessible than ever before, defeating the purpose of most remakes. Some video games need remakes or ports to be preserved for future generations to experience, because unfortunately, some of the best the industry has to offer is locked behind a hefty paywall. Aside from input and feedback, Sega had no direct involvement with the game's development. It appears that they were afraid to taint the game's legacy. They seem more content with porting their back catalog and letting publishers like Forever Entertainment assume all of the financial risks that come with developing a remake. I don't think this game is bad, but compared to the original, it's certainly not great. It's not very long either. One playthrough will yield around 30 minutes, and by the end of it, your trigger finger will be so sore you'll want the game to end. If this was bundled with the sequel and had more robust features, I'd have no problem recommending it. Perhaps the game's best feature is the unlockable weapons. In addition to your pistol, you can unlock a grenade launcher, crossbow, and assault rifle. In order to unlock them, first you need to save all of the scientists, which unlocks a secret armory that gives you the opportunity to go back and find the weapons hidden in each chapter. Having to unlock one of the remake's best features behind an admittedly difficult task really hurts the game's replayability. It's a shame that light gun games peaked in the 90s because there's still a lot this genre has to offer. It's a noble attempt by Megapixel Studio, but far from meeting the expectations of longtime fans. I could only recommend this game at a discount, and for PC users, I'd say wait for the modding community. Remember, winners don't use drugs, which is a phrase that always confused me because arcade games were specifically designed to be unfair for players to continue to pump quarters in the machines. You know what? Now that I say it out loud, I think it's supposed to be ironic. Play this House of the Dead remake, or pick up a crack pipe. I don't care. Put that quote in the back of the game's box.
We'll get him next time. Come on.